me say first of all that I think that what you're trying to protect, I'm a perfect example of it, and hopefully when I go through this you'll agree with that. The bottom line is that I've been walking point for the Constitution and what's right for a long time. I read with interest Glenn Beck's book about being George Washington, which was, basically he put himself out there in a line of fire over and over. For those of you who don't know what walking point, what that refers to, if you don't have a military background, my brother was one of the heroes of Hamburger Hill in Vietnam. And what they do is they'll put one guy about several hundred feet out in front of the rest of the battalion or whatever when they're marching, and he's the guy that gets shot. So the rest of them know that there's an enemy out there. So walking point is not a very comfortable position to be in. And certainly it's led to me being shot a number of times. I don't know really how to put the story together for you perfectly, but I'm going to try to do it a little bit chronologically because I think that might help. At the end of the story it'll be about the lawsuit. At the beginning I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood so that you'll know how I got to where I am. But basically I was a single parent home. We didn't have plumbing for the first 8 years or so of my life. At the school that I attended in Appalachia, we didn't have plumbing for the first 12 years of my life. I actually didn't take a hot shower until I was 19 years old when I started working in the coal mines. So life was different for me then than it is now. So in a way, I'm an American success story, but basically I refused to join the swamp. I refused to join, I would argue with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about everything from free trade to the policies they had on regulations. I actually did a documentary that you might enjoy if you go to my website called Reg Session, which is a play off the words regulation and recession, that we're not in a recession, we're in a regulation session that you don't get out of if you don't change your practices. But having lived through a childhood of that type where I basically survived as a child trapping muskrats and picking up pop bottles and collecting scrap metal and doing all the things that a kid is capable of doing, washing cars and so forth. I learned about hard work early on. And then I was able to get into Marshall University. Didn't have the money to go to school very much, so I worked in the coal mines during the summers in order to get money to pay tuition. Sometimes slept on the floor of other guys' apartments or whatever, and made it through college in 3 years. Afterwards, I went into the food business for about 10 years and moved around the country and did quite well, but because of an ailing mother and family issues, I came back to West Virginia to work in the coal business in 1982 at the age of 30. And it was shortly after that, 2 years later, that despite having the childhood I had working in the United Mine Workers, playing in the coal miners baseball leagues, being well known in the area, that the United Mine Workers decided to go out on strike against the company. And the management, which was then Shell Oil and Fluor Corporation, did not want to sign a union contract because we couldn't, we weren't making any money before that. So anyway, they put me in charge, and I was in charge of a very violent strike. During that time, the union killed one person. They put 91 in the hospital. They brought in a professional killer that shot a guy 27 times while he was driving a truck. The guy had been on death row before, but had gotten out, literally out of prison on a technicality. And at that guy had cut the other coal miner's head off and kept it in a freezer. At least that's what I told the public. And you might get a kick out of this because I feel like I've been slandered for years, but as I said yesterday, I got a letter from the guy that I was slandering him because he didn't keep the head. So, you get all kinds of experiences in life, but my experience with the United Mine Workers and with the media was incredible. I watched people be drug out of vehicles, drug out of trucks. I had 2 cars that belonged to me that was totaled while I was in them without them going off the highway by baseball bats and crowbars and so forth. I had 11 bullet holes in my office. I had multiple gunshots in my cars. I had my family under bodyguard for 14 months. At one time, I personally had 8 bodyguards. Death threats were common. And again, being that they were killing and shooting people, they shot 3 of our truck drivers in one day. And what I learned is that we don't have any rights. You know, you go back to the Constitution, you know, West Virginia wouldn't even bring charges against people that they knew had killed the coal miners. And instead, the federal government came in and arrested these guys for, quote, interfering with the transport of energy across state lines. So were it not for the federal government, the states didn't even have enough confidence or enough intestinal fortitude, if you will, to bring murder charges. Kentucky did bring murder charges against the one guy, and he eventually went to prison briefly, but not for very long on some other technicality. So it's incredible the experience I had during the strike. I talked yesterday about the experience I had with the campaign for the judge. West Virginia had been blue forever, and the issue with West Virginia was they had such a large part of the population that was poor. They wanted the handouts, but they also were very religious, and they didn't agree with the social issues, so they were torn for years. But eventually they converted to being red based on a lot of us' effort. At Massey, you know, I had a reputation for being tough, but we led the industry in safety. We had the coal company I'm now talking about. We also created more jobs. I think we had 7,000 jobs when I left there in a very small area. So I ran a very successful coal company. In fact, the most successful coal company probably in the history of Appalachia. In fact, I oversaw the mining of more coal than anyone in the history of Central Appalachia. And so, in fact, I had a rally one day in West Virginia that was the largest gathering of people in the history of West Virginia. And one day on a Labor Day rally in competition with United Mine Workers Labor Day rally that same day, we had 100,000 people come to hear me speak, while John Kerry at the UMWA rally had 3,000. So to give you an idea of the magnitude of the presence that we had at that time. But when Obama declared the war on coal, he decided, of course, to put in charge of the Mine Safety and Health Administration lifetime UMWA union members. Among those was a guy named Joe Main, who had been the personal secretary or administrative assistant of Cecil Roberts and Richard Trumpka for 30 years. And so he was put in charge of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. By that time, Richard Trumpka had become the president of the AFL-CIO. So the largest donor to President Obama, personal friend, was head of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. At Massey, we had decertified several union mines and had started a lot of non-union mines, and basically had converted the coal industry from union to non-union because the coal industry was basically going bankrupt. So here we had a situation where I had led the non-union charge, led the political charge, had grown up with coal miners, so I had a great deal of concern, respect, familiarity with them. And the war on coal took place. I had 100,000 people at a gathering on Labor Day. The union had 3,000. To say it mildly, the union had this thing about Don Blankenship. So Trumpka, he's the most frequent visitor to the White House, and we have the largest, most productive, most profitable mine in the eastern United States called Upper Big Branch. They send their MSHA guys down and they start writing violations like crazy. You know, they write violations in order to force you to do whatever it is they want to do. And what they wanted to do, of course, was slow production. So they began to change the ventilation plan and take away some of the intake air entries, which I don't want to get complicated about that, but the effect of all the changes they made was that they cut the air in the area where the miners were working in half. And they did this despite the company engineers telling them not to do it. All that work was completed about 7 o'clock in the morning on April 5th, 2010, and at 3:02 p.m., which was basically 8 hours and 2 minutes later, the mine blew up. 29 guys went off there. Okay, 29 miners died, in that instant. Barack Obama, just a few days later, before anyone had gone underground and any investigation could have begun, declared that the tragedy was first and foremost the responsibility of management. Okay, so shortly after that, the head of the Mine Safety and Health Administration, over coal mining, not the one that worked for the union all his life, but a guy that was sort of number two, because the Mine Safety and Health Administration, which I'll refer to as MSHA, oversees all mining, gold, silver, copper, whatever it is, salt. But coal mining is the biggest part of it. So he also came out and said in an email to everybody at MSHA, which was publicized, that for everyone at MSHA to remember that the operator blew up the coal mine, MSHA didn't. So they told that story for a while, and Obama promised to have DOJ investigators look into it, and eventually they arrested a guy that was working at the mine as a supervisor for having known that miners were telling each other that inspectors had arrived, and they threatened him. Of course, he pled guilty. And they arrested a security guard who also was accused of obstruction of justice, and they put both of them in prison. They had told me that I was not a target, but people feared they were. But anyway, I did a documentary that explained that what the MSHA inspectors and the government said that caused the explosion was totally false, that they said it was based on dust explosion because the miners failed to change their water sprays and keep their bits tight. So they basically blamed it on the miners. I did a documentary that said that wasn't true. And so within just a short period of time, Joe Manchin, the Democrat senator, came out and said that I should be indicted. In fact, he demanded that the prosecutor in West Virginia indict Don Blankenship. They didn't have anything to indict me on, so, but just a few months later, they did in fact indict me. They indicted me for a letter that had gone out to the SEC from the board, of which I was the chairman. I signed the letter just a few days after the explosion, basically explaining the situation, which is what shareholders expect you to do. And there was a sentence in the letter that said the company always strives to comply with the safety laws. It was 13 words long, the exact words. So they charged me with falsified letter to the SEC and falsified letter to the public, and tried to put me in prison for 25 years for a letter that I did not write, did not edit, and hardly even looked at, because we were busy on other things. So that's how we got to the situation with the trial. But for 35 years I had been slandered anyway because of the strike and so forth and so on. But we, the trial was pending with the indictment. Rockefeller comes out, who was then one of the senators, and says, I don't deserve a fair trial. The president had already said that we were responsible for the explosion. MSHA had said that. The investigation claim was that it was caused by dust and by the coal miners and so forth and so on. Forensics clearly showed that the mine had a natural gas explosion. As you well know, the gas industry has been booming and fracking and so forth. But anyway, immediately beneath the place that the explosion originated, there was a large crack that was probably twice as long as this room and about 2 or 3 foot wide right under where it blew up. And, the analysis that was done showed that the gas coming out of the mine after the explosion contained ethane and propane, which is not present in typical coal bed methane gas, showing and proving it was natural gas. So we knew it was natural gas, and the government knew it was natural gas, but they continued to argue that it was, or say publicly it was methane. Well, methane was a trick, because methane is 97% of coal bed methane and 90% of natural gas, so you can't say it's incorrect to say methane. But most all coal mine explosions are attributed to coal bed methane and not to natural gas. So the media played its role, if you will, in misleading the public about what had really happened. And the trial was pending, of course, and when I showed up at trial, I began to experience the great lack of constitutional rights. if you will, the prosecutors actually told the judge that I should be held under a higher bond, confined to house arrest, and be placed under a gag order because my free speech troubles the United States. So basically, as I went through this thing, I think I had 5 of the 10 Bill of Rights promises violated. I had a $5 million bond, which was about what the Boston terrorist had for what turned out to be a misdemeanor for an administrative fine. The house was searched, I think, 12 times. I used to ask him, are you looking for another mine violation at my house? Because I don't know what you're looking for. Not been charged with drugs or anything. The First Amendment right again was violated by the gag order. They took all my guns. They took everything from me. In fact, it was sort of ironic. Anytime I was near the courtroom or out in Charleston for any reason, they would have bodyguards, FBI agents around me to protect me. But in the total public eye, with hundreds of people in the courtroom and the press watching, they announced they were taking all my guns, and they were taking my dog. They were taking everything, and I was going to be confined to this house that I live in the country. So I'm not sure they were greatly interested in my security. But anyway, the trial was a sham from the beginning. The FBI agent who got up and testified first said he was there when they took all the material and so forth, and he had made sure the integrity of it was maintained. And then when my lawyer got up, he said, it's curious that you testifying to the fact that you have maintained the integrity of all this evidence, because you weren't there when that happened. You didn't even start to work for the FBI till 2 years later. So the first guy perjured himself. And the trial, they even placed the adjacent county's prosecutor on the jury. We had to use one of our strikes to get him off, who was the guy who would have to be elected. They wouldn't change the venue because of what they called victims' families' rights. And yet I wasn't being charged with anything to do with the explosion. They wouldn't even allow the word explosion to be mentioned in the trial. They wouldn't allow any evidence about the explosion. I was being charged with 3 felonies. One was advance notice of inspector violations, which I had no idea when an inspector was going to inspect. And what they were claiming was the miners were telling each other when the inspectors would arrive, and that constituted advance notice of an inspection, and that I had an obligation to stop them from doing it. So I wasn't being tried for a crime I committed. I was being tried for not preventing somebody else from committing what they considered to be a crime, for which no one had ever else been charged in history and had never even written a violation for. And the 13 words in the 2 letters, which was 25 years in prison. Some of the interesting things I learned, which would lead into criminal justice things, there is no definition of reasonable doubt. The judges can give whatever definition they want. I had an Obama-appointed judge who was sponsored and championed for confirmation by Rockefeller, who said I didn't deserve a fair trial. And certainly I didn't get one. But examples of what they did is, like if you get a traffic ticket, the cop has to come to the courtroom if you contested to testify that you were in fact doing what he wrote the violation for. They introduced 100 and some documents of paper from inspectors, and my lawyers objected every time, and they never had a single IMSHA inspector come in that wrote a violation to testify that he had in fact written that violation and observed that violation. So the constitutional violation there is that you are not given the right to cross-examine the witnesses against you, or to face the witnesses or your accusers. And that went on throughout the whole trial. One of the other tricks they pulled is they had fired a guy, and I had fired him for using drugs and reported him as you're required to as a corporation to do. And they had arrested him and put him in prison for the very things I fired him for, which was stealing from the company and drugs. And they were giving him a reduced sentence to testify against me. And of course it was no surprise that he testified, but he only testified to the fact that I was in the room when a discussion took place with the lawyers about whether it was illegal to give advance notice, and that was the whole extent of his testimony to get several years off his sentence. The biggest trick they pulled was on redirect. What they do in a trial is they will put on, they examine the witness, and then you get a chance to cross. But what they would do is they would put their case on and redirect, and the judge wouldn't allow recross. For example, in one case, they put in 60 exhibits with the witness on redirect and wouldn't let us have any recross. And this type of behavior went on throughout the trial. I mean, I could go on forever about what went on. But one of the interesting things was that, we never gave up. Talk about walking point. I mean, I was after the Mine Safety and Health Administration, after the DOJ and everybody. And finally, we shook loose documents with the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the MSHA, emails, for example, where one inspector was saying to another, "Don't worry about it, we had a shredding party last night," and I got rid of all those documents. And even with those documents, and even with presenting them, it didn't make no difference. We had documents that they actually disciplined their own inspectors for having put the ventilation plan in, but all that information was hidden. All of you that know about Brady material or Giglio or Jinx, they violated every one of those, and not only did they violate it, we uncovered it and they admitted it. And still the case is pending for invalidation in front of a judge, but it goes back to the same judge that did the other miscarriages of justice. So you can't get away from that cycle of that same judge. But the appeals court upheld that you can define reasonable doubt as a preponderance of the evidence. You are not allowed to redirect just because 60-some exhibits were introduced before, in the redirect, and you don't have, any rights regarding jury selection, even if they put prosecutors and so forth. They even have one lady on the jury that literally you could tell she was mentally ill. She couldn't even find her way up to the stand, and she kept mumbling as she went toward the judge, "I believe in the death penalty, I believe in the death penalty." Just mumbling like that. Couldn't even find her way up there. They put her on the jury. So we were using our strikes on the jury, as those of you that are familiar with the process, to get rid of prosecutors and people that were mumbling, UMWA members. People would even come up during the figuring out who could be on the jury, and they would say, "Well, I believe he's guilty, but I can set that aside." The judge would put him on the jury, and it was amazing. You wouldn't. The problem I tell everybody is when I tell the story about what was really done, they act like you saw a UFO. People can't believe what was actually done. And keep in mind, 60 Minutes and many of the magazines sat in the audience the whole time. They were only able to convict me of misdemeanor. But there's another thing you may not know. The prosecutor was the son of the judge in the same courthouse. And that judge was known as far left. It was Joe Bob Goodwin was the judge, and his son Booth Goodwin was getting ready to run for governor. The judge was running around town telling the legal community that his son's prosecution of me would be worth $1 million in earned media for his campaign for governor. But anyway, after they convicted me of a misdemeanor, 60 Minutes had him on immediately. And they said that I was like a drug kingpin running a criminal enterprise, and that I should have been sent to prison for longer, even though it was a misdemeanor. But anyway, my lawyers told me it was 110% that I would never go to prison. 100% I'd never go to prison. 110% I wouldn't go before an appeal. And they were so certain of it that when we went to the sentencing hearing and they sentenced me to go to Taft, that they said, "Don't bother to even go out there because they're not going to put you in prison before an appeal." And I said, "I don't think y'all understand, if you haven't noticed, we're not getting fair treatment. So if I'm not there to report, they're going to give me extra time." So I went out there, and sure enough, they put me in prison, the next day, just after I got out there. And everybody in the prison had watched 60 Minutes, and they had seen these story about me having killed 29 coal miners. So the first thing that happened was, it was like Shawshank Redemption. They put you in this suit and put your arms behind you and walk you across the prison yard, and everybody's saying, "That's the guy that killed 29 people." So you're not feeling very comfortable. There's 2,400 felons in the prison. I'm the only misdemeanor. 2,000 of them are illegal immigrants. And so couldn't talk to many of them. Don't speak very good Spanish. It's really hard to imagine. And it gets even worse. We continued to fight continued to file motions. My lawyers were just under shock. We get to a demand that the Office of Professional Responsibility, which is called the OPR, investigate the prosecution. And normally it just gets thrown out, but how in the world it got through, I don't know. But some guy, his name is, I don't know if I can think of it right now, but there was a guy in the DOJ, he's a lifer, and he actually wrote a 93-page report that said what was done in the prosecution with me should never happen again. So much so that the prosecutors should be disciplined to make certain that the actions they took are never repeated in the DOJ. In addition to that, we discovered that the son of the judge, the U.S. prosecutor, was said by the guy, the assistant prosecutor, that he was ordered not to turn over the Brady material. They failed to turn over 61 MOIs of FBI investigation interviews, if you know that they're required by law to turn over. 9 of those 61 were their 2 lead witnesses. And so the media, is well aware of that. They're aware that on my website is posted a 90-some page internal DOJ report that says that they violated the rules of protocol, they lied to the judge, they now are calling each other liars, and so forth and so on. The case to invalidate it has been laying on the judge's desk now for nearly a year. It's been in final form for going on 6 months, and he still will not rule. Why might he not rule is because he was appointed by Joe Manchin to be a judge in the state court before he became a federal magistrate judge. But even though the DOJ has admitted what they did, even though MSHA has admitted to shredding documents, even though they disciplined their people for the ventilation plan, and all that, there's still no public reporting on it. So, even the fact that the 2 lead witnesses both testified under oath for the prosecution. I should say, first of all, I didn't put on a defense. When they got through, we stood up and said they don't have a case and sat down. The whole world was in shock. But their own witnesses said that they were forced to change the ventilation plan by MSHA. It cut the air in half, and the explosion was not a coal dust explosion. The media didn't report any of that. The media hasn't reported on any of that truth. So I go to prison, and I wrote the little booklet, which is on my website, called American Political Prisoner, and I described a lot of this, the forensics and so forth and so on. And I had some of them sent into the prison. They nearly put me in the hole for it, because even though you're in a camp and you're a white-collar criminal, if you violate their rules, they'll put you in solitary confinement for a week or 2. So, but they were pretty upset that I'd sent those in, and of course that made me pretty popular in the prison then, because they saw that I was fighting back against these atrocities and criminal justice. But it's been an incredible journey, the walking point and so forth. But when I got out, I immediately began to run television ads that saying things like that the UBB cover-up by the government, which killed 29 coal miners and which they were responsible for, was worse than the lies about Benghazi. And of course, Fox News and them wouldn't even run the ads. We finally ran the ads a lot locally, and they got a lot of attention, and we kept running other ads about some of the things I just told you about, what went on in the trial, and how the indictment came about, and what Rockefeller had said. We started running ads like that. Of course, they were getting pretty angry, and I had done the documentary, like I say, explaining what had happened. And but we noticed that we were gaining momentum with the public, so I said, what the heck, ads are cheaper if you're running for office, so I just declared for U.S. Senate. And because truly the ads are about half as much. And of course we're going along, and we start off, we got 8 or 10% of the vote or something. There's 6 people on the vote, and we go along for about 2 or 3 months, and Fox News decides that since you got a criminal running for U.S. Senate, they're going to have a national broadcast of the debate. And they back and forth and back and forth. I happen to have a guy that I knew who's working from West Virginia who was working for Fox, and I talked to him a little bit about it. They called me up to New York and talked to me, and they decided, well, we're going to do this thing. So they put this clock up there about a week or so ahead of time, clicking down to when they're going to have this debate. And you might enjoy this story, but of course I had always said I didn't like Mitch McConnell, and because he had let the coal industry down. But anyway, I had started this thing about Ditch Mitch, and he started spending National Republican Senatorial Committee money to beat me. They spent $1.4 million in March alone running negative ads about me and Massey and the explosion and so forth, trying to beat their own Republican candidate. And of course, I had to say something back, so I started this thing about Cocaine Mitch, because they had caught his family's ship in Colombia carrying 90 pounds of cocaine worth $7 million, so I just made that public. But anyway, we're going to this debate, and I wear my Ditch Mitch hat. And when I show up, the Fox News team, Martha McCallum and Brett Baer and all these producers are there, and they say, you can't wear the hat. And I said, well, I'm going to wear the hat because, it's America, I'm going to wear the hat. They said, well, you can't wear the hat because we won't let you on the debate stage. And I said, that's fine, you've been advertising for 2 weeks, you got a clock that's been running for a week with a countdown about the criminal that's going to be in the debate. I'm going to wear the hat, or you're going to have an empty podium. And they said, well, we don't believe that. So the clock kept ticking, they'd go away for a while, and they'd come back. We were in makeup and preparation, and finally, about 5 minutes later, they asked to talk to my campaign manager, and they tried to convince him that I shouldn't wear the hat. Well, he got to pleading with me of their case, and finally they agreed they would show the hat, and they explained that I would have worn it, but they wouldn't let me and so forth. So it actually turned out better. They showed the hat about Mitch McConnell and so forth. And it was pretty interesting, if you watched it after, when they said, who would you vote for majority leader, then they knew I was not going to vote for, even as a Republican, I wouldn't vote for McConnell. So anyway, that became a big issue, and the debate went on. We went into the debate, we were already only 8 points behind. We came out of the debate 10 points ahead. It was a 18-point change in 24 hours. So what was weird is McConnell and his friends got together and they prepared a list of that they called in publicly a menu list of items to stop Blankenship. I had not been called a felon for the 3 years since I'd been indicted all the way through prison and everything. They would say bad things like, a mine that this guy was the president of the mine that blew up, killed 29 people, whatever. But they stayed away from the word felon. They actually reported that I was a misdemeanor. When went to prison for a misdemeanor, the only one at Taft. But starting April the 24th, which was slightly before the debate, up through the debate, and even when I was kind of get on the ticket after the primary as a Constitution Party candidate, they called me, they being the national media, the big time bloggers and so forth, called me a felon more than 100 times. And so we looked at that. After the thing, it took me a long time to find an attorneys that I was comfortable with. But we now have a lawsuit pending against 79 media outlets across the board for having called me a felon. We make the point that we didn't sue them for calling me a moron or a racist or a bigot or an idiot or any of those other things they called me. Because I did call Mitch Cocaine Mitch, I guess, but the word felon has a distinct meaning. You're either a felon or you're not a felon. So we think we have an excellent chance of winning the case. But the case is, in my mind, critically important. It's going to do a number of things that we can't really do politically, and I made a list of them. I don't know if I even can find it, but one thing it's going to do, if we're successful, and we should be, and it'll cost me a couple $1 million probably, is it will do away with this public figure idea. The law is that if you're a public figure, they can say bad things about you, but they can't say fully untrue things that change people's minds and do it with malice or intent. So we'll overcome those hurdles, but I think more importantly, we will send a signal to the national media that voters have a right to know the truth. You can't, as Napolitano did, say on April 24th, going into a debate and election, that I was sent to prison for manslaughter when I was sent to prison for a misdemeanor. And so I'm very hopeful that we will change that law. And we will, I hope, change the ability of the National Senatorial Committee, Republican Senatorial Committee, to sabotage elections. And that's the reason I had to add Trump Jr. to it, because he was at a National Republican Senatorial Committee meeting had breakfast with him, came out and said I was a felon, and also said that I went to prison for my actions, which caused the deaths of 29 coal miners just 4 days before the election. But it was interesting to see the magnitude of what they were willing to do. I mean, they were willing to put me in prison for a misdemeanor. They were willing to have a false trial. They were willing to openly say that, that I blew up the mine. They didn't. They were willing to lie about what happened. They were willing to deny the forensics. I'd never seen or never expected. I've been in a lot of civil cases where I saw the Robin Hood thing. You're a big corporation. You're going to lose to some small claimant. But I never realized how criminal the criminal justice system is. And it's so subjective because nothing is based on the law. Those of you that are in the law, like Darrell, whatever, y'all know that it's all about prior cases. So the law is almost all common law. And it's remarkably subjective in the sense that the judges can pretty well do what they want to do. I mean, it surprised me as well that we actually have every federal district has a different law, and they define reasonable doubt differently, or they have different positions on the same issue, and a lot of that stuff never gets to the Supreme Court to be fixed. I do think that the lawsuit has the opportunity to bring attention to the criminal justice reform. What they did, I think it's Kirshner, Trump's son-in-law, what they did was a little bit of prison reform, which is badly needed as well. But the criminal justice system, basically they know what to do because it's in the prosecutor protocol manuals, but they don't follow it. There's no teeth, there's no way to enforce it. So they just comply with it when they want to. And that's the reason you see so many poor people or so many people that don't have the ability to defend themselves in prison. I would be in prison for life did I not have $15 million to defend myself. And that's what the guys in prison figured out. They figured out that this guy is on our side. He spent his money to defend himself, despite the fact I probably could have pled and got off with, practically nothing. But the prisoners learned that, it's not just the minority, it's not just the poor guy, it's whoever that they want to take out. And that flexibility needs to be taken away. Of course, I learned tremendously about the corrupt media. As I said, they sat through the entire trial and didn't report anything. I mean, not only are they reporting I'm a felon, they never reported anything that IMSHA was shredding documents. They never reported that the OPR report reported out of the Department of Justice itself says that they were guilty of gross misconduct and conduct that should never be repeated, that they lied, that they intentionally withheld information, that they're calling each other liars. They never report any of that. So it's not just that they call you a felon or not just that they brand you, it's that they don't tell the other side of the story at all. And this is the government itself that has basically admitted to falsely imprisoning me. Little things that you might not know is that when you get convicted of a misdemeanor in this country, the banks will close your bank accounts. I mean, as a guy who has a good bit of money, UBS, BB&T, Wells Fargo, I mean, they close your bank accounts. So you're out there searching for places to put your money. The other thing you might not know, if they put you in prison for a misdemeanor, you cannot make a single phone call about your investments while you're in prison. So you're in there for a year. So when I was reporting to prison, I dumped millions of dollars of options and so forth in 5 minutes because the lawyers kept telling me I wasn't going, as you remember, and when I knew I had to go, I had to do all kinds of things just in a matter of minutes. And again, even when I made the closing statement that I could make at sentencing, my sentencing statement, they wouldn't allow me to tell the public what really happened at the mine explosion. The judge, as soon as I said, I'd like to take this opportunity to explain to the public what happened at Upper Big Branch in the mine explosion, she immediately said to my lawyers, he cannot do that. I mean, it's incredible. And then just in the last few days, if you followed me at all, when I sued Donald Trump Jr., and we tried every way in the world not to, tried to get him to sit down and talk, tried to get him to explain why he did what he did, tried to get him to sign a tolling agreement to delay the statute of limitation. He wouldn't do it. But when we finally sued him, we were going to issue a press release to explain the facts. MP Newswire, which is the big outfit worth $1 billion and some dollars that you send your press releases through, you pay a fee and they distribute it through to media throughout the country for $300 or $400. When we wanted to announce it, refused to announce it. They sent me the email that said basically that my press release was inflammatory, critical of the government, and couldn't be proven, so that they would not release it. So we just took their email, wrote at the top of it, we tried to explain why we sued Trump Jr. The National Public Newswire Agency would not release it, and here below is what they said. That made them even angrier, and they sent an email back that said that they wouldn't do business with me at all. So basically what you've got, in addition to what was being explained earlier, that you've got 5 or 6 multinational corporations that are controlling what messages you see in the media. You've also got a newswire organization that's filtering what you can get out, what you can say, and what you can't say. It's been amazing, and make sure that everybody knew about my circumstances. That political prisoner book I wrote, which was in prison, which was like 50 pages or so, I sent it to every state legislature in the United States, every state judge in the United States, every legislator in Washington, D.C., including Senate and House, every Supreme Court member, and every major press outlet in the country, and nobody reported on it. And it outlines in there why we know forensically it was a natural gas explosion. Basically, it's 3 things. It's the fact that the explosion wasn't powerful enough to be a coal dust explosion. It wasn't dirty enough to be a coal dust explosion. And it wasn't hot enough to be a coal dust explosion. To make it simple for you, even though it can get complicated, the temperature of a natural gas explosion is about 1,200 degrees. The temperature of a coal dust explosion is about 2,200 degrees. So you can easily tell by what melted and the condition of the bodies and so forth which one it was. And you can also tell by the amount of dust that was dispersed, and you can tell by the explosive forces how far stuff was moved. Something that weighed 100 pounds, you can simulate how far it would have gone. So it was easy to determine it wasn't what the government said it was. And when even when McConnell and the guys approved the new IMSHA head that Trump appointed after all this happened, the one question they asked him was, can you commit to not reopening the Upper Big Branch mine explosion after you're put into the IMSHA office? So hopefully that explains to you just how bad it is. If you're walking, the important thing is, if you're walking point like I have been against the mine unions and against the liberal side and against the press and in favor of the Constitution, they will come after you. And so I appreciate what y'all do, because I don't know how we're going to make it if we can't fix this stuff, because it's just absolutely incredible how far they will go. And so if you think what you're working on is more important than the driveway or some of your people do, it's not, because it's only hope we have of becoming a socialist country and so forth is the ability to speak out and the ability to make free speech. But my free speech has been attacked over and over again. My 4th and 5th, 6th Amendment rights have been violated. It's not something that might happen. It's something that is happening. It's not something that we can ignore. And of course, I'm doing everything I can, and this lawsuit will probably take 2 or 3 years, so it's going to be a long grind. But the one thing you can tell is, unlike the kid with the Indian issue and unlike all these other issues, it's serious in their mind, because they will not say a word. Napolitano, Neil Cavuto, Chris Hayes, Elizabeth Cupp, if you know that name, it doesn't matter right or left. They've obviously gone into deep freeze. They will not say a word. And I can say anything about them I want now, so maybe that's one proves I got. They're not going to say anything. They obviously have gotten legal advice that the last thing they want to do is say anything. In summary, what I am is a guy that grew up poor, ended up with some money, refused to join the swamp or the establishment, have been critical of it, have fought back against it, and have been falsely incarcerated, slandered, and there seems to be no end to it. So we keep fighting, and we'll see how this case comes out. I don't know if that took all my time. I'd be glad to answer a question, but. Okay, anything that anybody wants to ask in clarification?
Where was the prison?
He asked where the prison was at. It was it was just outside of Bakersville, California, at Taft, and it's the reason they sent me there was so I wouldn't get killed in prison. They were afraid to put me in prison in West Virginia because they had told everybody I killed 29 coal miners, and that probably wouldn't have been very popular in Morgantown. So it was would have been even worse. But it was. Prison camp is not bad, except that you have no communication. You get 10 minutes on the phone calls a day. The food's not very good, and all that. But what I was surprised is most of the guys in there, or a lot of the guys, I should say, are in there as a result of a government-caused crisis. There's a lot of guys in there over the savings and loan scandal, people over the Horizon explosion, or people that are caught up in the disparity between state law on marijuana. Doctors that prescribe marijuana, and they're in there. It's amazing the caliber, and I know that outside this room, people would laugh at this or say, well, use it against me. But the caliber of the guys that was in the block I was in, which was where there was 400 white-collar criminals, was incredible. I played chess at the national level. I was the only freshman to play chess at the national level in college, and I could not beat these drug dealers to save my life. They are extremely smart, and it was so odd to see so many people that had achieved a lot in life in prison. And what's the shame of it is they put them in there for 20 years. Their families suffer more than they do. All they got to do is take their license out and put them in a hole for 6 months, and they would never do it again. But 18-year-old kids that are put in prison for 20 years for transporting marijuana across the state line with a gun. A guy been in there 20 years, and he don't even know what a smartphone is. Go ahead.
Thanks for sharing your story with us. I'm just curious what you have for your political future and what office you're planning to run for next.
Well, I'm actually a little confused about that. I know that I could probably be helpful if they would probably argue I'm not qualified because I live back and forth between Nevada and West Virginia to run for governor. But I know if I ran for governor, I wouldn't have to do anything except put my name on the ballot, and you'd get 1% and be qualified for a Constitution Party. I actually think I could win the Democratic primary because I think they're so out of touch with their people. That I've thought about that. It's actually insane. As I said yesterday, it's total insanity that the Democratic Party platform is totally adverse to their members. And I think it would catch them totally off guard if I got up there and said, why in the world are you people for, near-term birth for abortion when you can end the pregnancy at 22 weeks and save the child? So you win twice, so you at least ought to have enough sense not to be killing babies when you don't have to even end the pregnancy. But there's a lot of things that could be done that would show at least that you have a better understanding of what the impact is on people's lives than do the people that are running for office. Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders wanting to go socialist. There's still a lot of Archie Bunker Democrats out there, which is what Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is a Archie Bunker with $1 billion, and so I hated suing his son because I support a lot of his policies. But he also needs to understand that we don't want to create another swamp. We want to drain the one we got, but we don't want to create another one. And that's what we're observing because McConnell and Flake and Cronin and even Thune are, if you will, not endorsing his policy. So we're not draining the swamp. We're basically just converting it to a different kind of swamp. But he has, the alternative was so bad. I actually made Hillary Clinton's book, and I've been accosted by about all the presidents and all the business leaders and so forth. And that's another thing you'll learn when you're getting chased by the establishment. The part of the establishment that you've been friends with will abandon you in a moment. So it's been teaching experience. You know, the Greek mythology teaches you that they don't have capital punishment. They just give you full knowledge of how the world really works, and you kill yourself. So, you know, the more I learn about it, the more frustrated I get. So, go ahead, J. David.
Thank you for your story. I was wondering, did you happen to, and feel free to not share this, do any calculations on how much money maybe they disrupted or took from you personally when they shut down all of your personal trades for that period of time? You had mentioned $15 million perhaps just in defending yourself, but then there's all those other costs that went above that to when they paralyzed you from that.
Yeah, it's been millions. I don't know the exact number because I wasn't even allowed to see my portfolio for a year. And, you know, it was incredible. They record every call, and with me they had a lot of focus on me, so I knew if I made any mention of a financial investment or anything on a prison phone that they could put me in the hole. They nearly put me in the hole on 3 or 4 different other things. I mean, they searched me 44 times. Total strip search, naked search 44 times. I don't know what they expected to find, you know. They would empty my locker. They, you know, when I first got there, I asked the security guard that was transporting me across thing, I said, how many misdemeanors you got here? And he said, what are you talking about? This is a federal prison. They don't put misdemeanors in federal prison. And I said, well, you're transporting one here now. And he said, there's no way. And his other buddy who was his boss was there, and he turned to him and said, this guy says he's a misdemeanor. And the other guy laughed, said, there's no misdemeanors here. So he's just lying. So a couple of days later, that guy comes back and says, man, you're really a misdemeanor. I said, yeah, sure enough. Go ahead.
Thank you for your story, Mr. Blankenship. Al Pisano with the Constitution Party of North Carolina. Excuse me.
Congratulations on all the success you're having.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that. We're going to keep going. My question is, I remember when President Obama basically declared war on the coal industry. Were you the casualty of that?
Well, no doubt. What happened was where I had converted so much of the coal industry to non-union. In fact, the mine, this will make that clear to you, the coal mine that exploded and the 29 guys left, lost their lives. They had been United Mine Worker members for years and years. We bought the mine. We had a right to, you know, rehire them, and we hired union guys. They signed a petition to join the union. They came in to the National Labor Relations Board to hold the vote, and the union lost. The union couldn't believe it. What I did was sort of like my Brent Benjamin sign I told you about. I happened to fall in line just by God's grace, I guess, behind a guy with a union sign on the back of his pickup truck that had Sierra Club, you know, Save the Earth. It had everything you could imagine on that truck that didn't fit with the interest of the United Mine Workers. And I took a picture of that truck just a few days before I met with the workers and asking them not to vote for the union. And I stood up on the back of a truck in the middle of a bunch of coal miners every shift, including the middle of the night, and explained to them and showed them that picture and gave them all a picture and said, your union's against you. And that's the reason that they ask you to vote for Obama, they ask you to vote for John Kerry, they ask you to vote for Al Gore, all of which were against you. And we won both of those elections to decertify the union. And so that mine, because of its size and profitability and the fact that it voted, became the war on coal. And you know, when they came in there, they chose it. It was the only mine in the eastern part of the United States that was limited from having 2 intake airways at the time it exploded. Every mine in the United States except that single mine could take air in 2 20-foot wide entries, and it was limited to 1. And the reason was the law is so archaic and so antiquated that the law is you only have to have 30,000 cubic feet per minute of air across the face. But it was written probably in 1950 before the automation of the industry. And now the equipment stirs up so much more dust, it's so much more powerful and so faster, it needs to be at least 100,000. And we were keeping 120, 140,000. But the government cut it to 60,000 because it was still twice what the law requires. And they hid behind the law, which was just totally outdated for today's modern equipment. But to give you an idea of how I could tell you stories all day, and I know they would interest you, but while I was being tried and they were accusing me of putting profits over safety, they were featuring on the web page, home page of the Mine Safety and Health Administration, an invention I called a detection device, which would shut a piece of equipment down if a miner got in a dangerous position automatically. And they were touting my invention, my innovation, as being the greatest innovation in the last 5 decades for mine safety, which cost the company millions of dollars, while they were claiming that I put profits over safety. At the same time, the MSHA was pictured in the picture with uniforms that I designed of reflective clothing, because in the years before me, you had a little sticker on your hard hat that you could see in the dark with a light hit it. But we had a guy get killed because he got run over by a piece of equipment, and I had uniforms made that are fully reflective that MSHA now wears. They adopted my dozer safety thing, which is a dozer has oxygen and has the ability for the operator to survive if he's trapped down below a coal pile or sinks down in a coal pile. They adopted that and put it into law. I've invented probably 27 different items that I could have patented for millions of dollars that we gave to the rest of the industry. And the rest of the industry uses our manuals and our training. We had the most sophisticated training facilities. But they ignored all that. The press heard that, ignored it. You know, if they would report the truth, the image that I had would be exactly the opposite of what it is. I mean, we did more for safety and more for the community. I don't know how many parks we built. I invented the concept of spousal groups, which all the spouses of our employees could join a charitable organization that the company funded. We gave gifts and food at Thanksgiving and Christmas to thousands of children in Central Appalachia. I personally have given away millions of dollars in donations, built gymnasiums, but none of that mattered because the swamp wanted to end my influence. In fact, so much so, as I said, that the prosecutor said in open court in a federal courtroom to a federal judge that agreed that this guy should have a higher bail, be under a gag order, and placed under house arrest immediately because his free speech troubles the United States.
Oh my gosh.
It's amazing. And nobody said anything. You know, and the press the whole time, the press is defending the government against me. They're supposed to be defending me against the government. I mean, they won't issue my press releases. They won't let me on. I tell you how bad it is even further back. Before the explosion and when I was running Massey and when I had the 100,000 people, they would invite me on local West Virginia television to do interviews. And I would do interviews, and I stopped Manchin's bond. He was going to go $5.5 billion in debt. I advocated to eliminate the food tax in West Virginia under the premise that taxing people's food is fundamentally wrong. Anyway, I had made those kind of changes and was converting West Virginia to red. When Manchin was the governor, he had his staff call those TV stations and tell them that if they interviewed me, they would get no lottery advertising and they would get no tourism advertising from the state. So they stopped interviewing me to stop me that time. So they refuse to distribute my stuff. They won't have me on television. So I'm very reliant, and I was glad to see these other ideals on social media. But you know, it's been interesting, and we still tweet and still put stuff out. But we have our own list of media, but we don't have the ability to distribute it as widely as we should. You know, it's funny, they'll make a small family bakery sell a cake to 2 men that are going to get married, but they won't distribute my press releases. So it's really incredible. Other questions?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
We'll have to get that last question.
Paul Venable, Missouri.
Paul.
On the day of the explosion, is there anything that could have warned you what was going to happen?
No. The only thing that, if I missed anything, it was that we had what they call ignitions, which was just a pop in the past. And I would ask my engineers about it, and they always told me that it's just, you know, a little bit of gas came out of the face, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know enough about the chemistry and so forth to demand what I did. I'm the guy that caused the government to test the gas afterward chemically and determine that it was natural gas instead of coal gas, I'll call it. It's more appropriately called coal bed methane. But anyway, the only thing I feel badly about But I had engineers, I had chemists, I had everything in the world around me, but I didn't demand that the gas be analyzed. And had it been analyzed, looking back, I suspect that the gas that have caused the pops on occasion was natural gas as well. But on the day of the explosion, I had no idea. I mean, I didn't even know they were making all those changes. We had 119 coal mines, of which this was one. And, attacking and putting me in prison would be like attacking the Boeing airline CEO or others that are in the industry that have had accidents. They didn't put the BP president in prison for Horizon and so forth. But they attacked me clearly for political reasons. They didn't attack me because I was running an unsafe company. They attacked me because they knew that I was having political influence. Okay? Thank you very much.